A wonderful panel. Thank you so much, Yasmin, and Didier and Jason and Raviv. Thank you so much. Really important topic, which our global community and Webit Foundation will be more and more focused on during the next 1 year. Now, moving next to our next panel, and my job's so easy when we have such a great moderators and host. Leisha, I'll leave it to you to introduce yourself and panel.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us for today's panel on green growth and sustainability predictions. We have a great panel of guests and experts to talk through on this, starting with Justin Kamine, co-founder and partner, Forbes 30 Under 30 at KDC. We have Jennifer Morgan, executive director at Greenpeace International, Sharan Burrow, general secretary at the International Trade Union Confederation, and David Jensen, head of the environmental peace building program at the UN Environment. So thanks everyone for joining us. I'm just going to launch straight in. The last 2 years under the pandemic has been challenging for everyone, all sectors of business. And really, you know, we've seen major changes to people's behavior due to COVID-19. In terms of your own personal experience, what have been some of the biggest challenges or shifts that you've experienced in your line of work? Let's start with Justin.
Sure. So pleasure to be here and excited. So the quick background on the family is we've built about $4 billion worth of infrastructure nationwide across the United States. And over the past kind of 4 or 5 years, we've been very focused on to everything from indoor agriculture to food waste conversion technologies and renewable energy. And specifically, I think looking at the food waste conversion technology to really create closed loop, waste-free, sustainable infrastructure across the US. COVID has actually exposed a lot of the supply chain issues and the reliance upon this kind of global network to really be able to provide enough food, enough resources to each location. And I think the pandemic obviously has caused a tremendous amount of harm, but it's also enabled us to really help be the leader in creating kind of micro closed loop infrastructure that hopefully improves national security, improves resource resiliency, reduces the reliance upon imports, and really creates an entirely new economy where we are upcycling all of, whether it be food, whether it be cardboard, major infrastructure platforms that we are now building nationwide to utilize our resources in a much more advantageous and meaningful way. And the whole terminology of upcycling and the utilization to the next best usage can really create what we believe is the next economy, which is really driving kind of forward sustainable infrastructure at scale and really creating a better and more environmentally progressive economy.
Jennifer, I think the last 2 years under the pandemic has helped heal a lot of our environment, but as economies, you know, bounce back from lockdowns, we see again that shift back to old behaviors and consumption patterns. What are some of the big challenges going forward that, you know, you've experienced?
Well, I think certainly the pandemic demonstrated the interrelationship between nature and people, how dependent we are on nature in order to live healthy lives, and how important it is to be avoiding the disruption and the devastation of it. I think, you know, in a way, the big challenges, I would say, for an organization like Greenpeace has been, you know, a lot of our work happens with people out on the streets and bringing them together. And so our activists, volunteers had to come up with new ways of reaching people, which they did. Incredible creativity that occurred, from holograms to special deliveries at home in a COVID safe way, to be finding ways to online demonstrations, to be finding ways of connecting people virtually across the board. I think the other big challenge, it was an opening, but it unfortunately became a challenge, is that the billions, that went into the economy, it was an opening and a chance to really put the well-being of people on the planet first. And I think what we unfortunately saw is that the vast majority, or a good chunk of the funds that went into the economy to try and build it back, continued to go to fossil fuel interests and not necessarily going to the benefits of people, or certainly nature. And you see that across the board and kind of where those funds are going. And that remains a big challenge, obviously, to the system. I think we're resilient, and Greenpeace is very lucky to have supporters all around the world that are still there holding people accountable. But it's forced a new level of creativity, a new focus on digitalization, certainly to stay on the front foot.
And Sharan, how has it been for you when it comes to tackling the challenges of the climate crisis under the pandemic in your work?
So we're dealing with a convergence of crisis. Even before COVID-19, we already had historical levels of inequality and indeed the climate emergency. And then COVID-19 simply laid bare those fault lines that, others have spoken about in terms of a global economy, and excluded people. We saw that the labour market's broken. 1.6 billion people who work informally were just struggling to survive day by day. And of course, we saw the job losses, the income losses in the more formal sector of the economy, where work is increasingly precarious or insecure. So we need to have a new social contract put in place, which is indeed all about jobs, jobs, and jobs that are climate-friendly jobs with just transition. Jennifer's right. We need to see all investment, every dollar, euro, unit of currency, have an ESG lens on it, because if it's not going to deal with the economic conditions that Justin talked about, or indeed the security of people, then we'll fail again in what is now a race against time for both people and the planet. But we need those jobs to also be rights-based, to be underpinned by universal social protection, which is the resilience for increasing extreme weather events or economic shocks, or indeed further climate shocks, health shocks, I should say, because climate shocks are inevitable. And of course, we need to make sure that equality is genuinely on the agenda, income equality, but also equality of gender and race. Because if we don't really look at both planet and people as a kind of both sides of the tram tracks, then we're not going to face the future with any kind of confidence, because the level of trust or distrust we saw in Glasgow between what was on the inside and the people's despair and anger on the outside is absolutely the reality that's holding us back. So we need the tools. At the heart of those are investment in climate solutions and in jobs, and we know that the two go together.
Well, Sharan, you have already mentioned the race against time when it comes to the climate crisis. And at COP26, we have seen that the commitments made have been criticized as not being enough to tackle the severity of the situation that global society finds itself in. And yet, as Justin and Jennifer have also pointed out, there are so many big issues, be it jobs, circular economy, green infrastructure, that need to be tackled. So coming to David, do we have enough time left to tackle such a plethora of critical issues, and all highly complex, before the clock runs out, essentially, which was what was said at COP26 in Glasgow?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm obviously very concerned about the lack of time that we have, and I think it's very, very clear that if we're going to accelerate action at this timescale, that digital technologies are going to be a key engine to do that. So we need to start harnessing digital technologies, data, digital transformation to sort of move at that speed and scale to hit those goals. And I think ultimately we need to start looking at kind of the production side of the coin and the consumption side, and asking how technology can really help accelerate climate action on both. And I think on the production side, the key thing here is digitalizing supply chains and measuring the impact, the environment and climate impact of a product or service across its entire supply chain and disclosing that publicly. On the production side, I think the big opportunity is helping consumers identify carbon neutral and net zero products and services through the ecosystem of digital apps and various mobile applications. So I really think that it can be done, but we're going to have to embrace digital technologies to do it.
But Jennifer, do you buy the argument that technology is the answer to the climate crisis when companies and countries continue to consume fossil fuels, to continue to build coal-fired plants and so forth, or rely on their use? Is technology really enough, especially given we have big gaps between the developed nations and emerging markets?
Clearly, we need more than that. My guess is that David would probably agree with that as well. But I think if you ask me, it's really about an entire systems change that needs to be brought about, and looking at how to tackle the issues of inequality and climate injustices and racial injustices in the same go, which basically means we need to reboot that system, and we can do that. I think if you look at Glasgow, one of the things that came out of that meeting was indeed a signal around the need to phase out coal, phase out fossil fuel subsidies, and the movements across the world that are working on that and doing that in a just transition way in order to be building a better future for people are strong. And I think that was a bit of a, the reason why you even had those things in that text in Glasgow is because of those movements around the world. It's not really a question of the technology. It's not really a question of knowing which policies to put in place. It's a question of actually the leadership, the jumping forward, the boldness and the courageousness that's required of leaders right now across the board. But also, I think, another clear signal out of Glasgow was that kind of net zero commitments from the private sector, from companies that are full of offsets and full of, kind of hot air and scams are not going to be tolerated. The UN Secretary General is setting up a group of experts to try and get some standards put in place there. I think that's incredibly important as well. So it really is for leaders, though, kind of who they're listening to as they move forward, because they, should have left Glasgow, gone back to work. They have to come back in 1 year's time with more action. And people aren't going to accept, as Sharan said, that the level of frustration, anger, and fear, means that they have to come back with a real set of actions next year, and optimally before then, obviously.
Justin, I want to come to you and pick up on something that Jennifer touched on there around corporate or governmental pledges and promises, as well as whether there could be enforcement or accountability when it comes to testing these climate promises. Do you think that corporations really can be held to account? Do you really think that they are entering into these pledges, such as carbon offsets, with the full intention of carrying them out?
Well, I think there's a huge opportunity. I was reading this recent stat that 70 to 80% of consumers want to be a part of the solution. And I think that is the vehicle, that is the flywheel that we absolutely have to engage with. And these corporations are always going to be driven by economics. It's first and foremost what really drives them. And we need to empower and showcase that the consumers can be a part of the solution. So we can't have greenwashed kind of products. We actually have to have real tangible products that actually make a net positive difference in the world. My platform for Do Good Foods is upcycling 160 tons of what previously would have been food waste every single day into an animal feed. And when we feed that animal our product, it actually now saves, for every chicken that we grow, 4 pounds of surplus grocery food and 3 pounds of greenhouse gases. A measurable equation that's actually now finally empowering consumers to buy a product that they know and that they love, a piece of chicken, and now know that they're actually doing good in the world and actually helping to save food waste. And what's so exciting by that platform is it's making tangible difference, and it's launching literally this coming January. It's not about by 2050, we hope to solve food waste. It's over the next 3 to 5 years. I already have $180 million behind me and a facility fully scaled that I now just need to duplicate that nationwide and to showcase to the world that we can be a part of our own solution. Buy a piece of chicken, save the world, fight food waste, combat climate change in an understandable equation, and to link all of that together in a closed loop system where it's not technologically advanced. It's reverting nature back to the way it intended to operate. We all used to take our leftovers and feed it to our chickens and pigs and pets out back. They grew healthy, they grew great. We got too sucked up into this major corporations as to how do you work with the biggest retailers of the world and start to change the supply chains and the way we grow food and the way we interact with our environment. We have to embrace that, understand that, but first and foremost, make it an economically viable solution for them, followed by a win for the environment, and pair all of that with a win for the consumer. And that entire system is the only way, in my opinion, that we can drive these solutions to scale now, not over the next 20, 40, 50 years. I'm tired of these pledges. We don't have time for a pledge to hopefully we get by 2050. I don't have kids, but they're all screwed by 2050. Just calling it very bluntly, right? We need scalable solutions now that, and I don't think that we need technological breakthroughs. We just need to work all together and say, hey, how do we enable consumers to continue to act the way that they want to act and actually now have a net positive in the world? And that's what Do Good Foods, which we're about to launch, is all about. And that's true, tangible Scope 3 emissions, not buying offsets, not dealing with government subsidies, not doing anything, just making it an economically viable equation that puts the environment first and foremost.
But I think, as some others have mentioned, scale is very important, especially since it has to be a global coordinated effort. So Sharan, one of the things that we've seen governments do is to come out with very big infrastructure plans, whether it's Build Back Better in the States with an environmental green focus to the British government's leveling up agenda, also with a very heavy environmental focus. Does this push towards big, giant infrastructure plans help really shift the dial much faster? And how important is it in creating new green jobs?
Well, it depends on the nature of the infrastructure plan. Jennifer hit the nail on the head when she said we've spent 17 trillion in the recovery, and so much of it has simply gone into reconstructing the economy we have, not shifting it with conditionality to sustainability. And that's a disaster, frankly. I'm very angry with the fossil fuel companies because they actually do have the money, the technology, the assets, the skilled labour force to make the transition to renewables. We know they could protect and grow jobs if they want to, because there are jobs in renewables. For every 20 jobs in renewable energy, there's up to 10 in manufacturing supply chains. And if they're good jobs with just wages, there's 30 to 35 in the broader economy. That's how you actually transition communities. We know that for every dollar or euro or unit of currency you invest in this economy that Justin is talking about, you know, whether it's a circular economy, which we have to actually get all of our cities to be engaged in, if it's whether or not it's about, supporting local production and managing relationships in a very different way with the big multinationals. We have to make sure that people and their communities are at the heart of this. We know it's possible. We know investment drives more jobs. We just have to make sure they're quality jobs. But what worries me is, I can sit here and absolutely clap Justin and David and say, yes, let's just do it. But I see the pushback everywhere. The fossil fuel language in the COP declaration started as much stronger and ended up as inefficient fossil fuel levies. What we need to be doing is saying we need to repurpose that money in the way Justin's talking about to make sure it's actually creating new sustainable economic conditions where people and their communities benefit, as well as we see a new, much more sustainable economy. David, the same will happen with digitalisation. I could absolutely say you're right. And I want to see, by the way, traceability against dehumanising supply chains, which ignore workers' rights. But I also can already see the vested interest pushing back. So we need to say to all of those companies who made those pledges, and Justin, I'm so over pledges too. I know Jennifer is, we all are, but we can hold every one of them to account. What's their plan without offsets? That's just an excuse to get to net zero faster than to 2050, because we don't have that time, you're right. And what's their plan for jobs, and how do they engage, you know, workers with their unions, and where it's necessary, the community in the design and the future of that. That's when we'll hold them to account.
And quickly, Sharan, when you talk about building that consensus and bringing the community into it, what role does gender equality or other minority communities play in building this more resilient society, overcoming the climate crisis and the challenges from it?
Well, if this economy we must build is not an inclusive one, then we don't do anything to dispel the despair, the fear, and therefore the anger that we're seeing everywhere around the world. And it's just an invite for the extremist political right to actually undermine our democracies. So for women, for example, if they're at the table, then I can already tell you in renewable energies, there's, you know, more jobs than there are today in fossil fuels already, and then there could be more. In terms of looking at resilience and building back better, if that's the terminology you want, if we don't have the resilience of care, of social protection where women dominate, then we see the exclusion where people don't have access to healthcare, or they don't have access to education or childcare or aged care. So women are cut out of economic opportunities. We can change this, but it has to be part of the design. And that's why we talk about just transition, which means that workers and their communities are part of the equation for building a sustainable future.
These all sound really fantastic in principle, but you know, implementation or execution in reality has proven to be very difficult. David, do you think that given what we saw at COP26 and the previous climate summits, as well as how some countries have struggled even with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, do you think that the pace of climate change that we're seeing now will lead to more cooperation, or could it actually just lead to conflict?
No, that's a great question. I don't really think it's an either or situation. It's probably a mix of both. I think you've got climate change basically, you know, affecting the drivers of conflict, generating more resource scarcity, generating more competition for those scarce resources, and creating more displacement from the disasters it's causing. So definitely it's an additional stressor that can actually lead to conflict. At the same time, we see that communities are increasingly cooperating over shared natural resources and over shared climate risks. So you see both at the same time. I'm obviously optimistic, very optimistic that the cooperation side of that equation will prevail. I think, but certainly in the short term, there will be increased stress, there will be increased tension, and some of that will boil over into conflict.
So if we want to avoid that situation where we're basically frogs in a pot of boiling water, Jennifer, how can we hold governments, investors, our colleagues and communities better to these commitments that we all need to make? What is a good formula to take in this approach, and making sure that we start taking that action properly rather than just the hot air, as you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I mean, many different ways. I think the first is, if you're able to vote, look at the platform that your candidates are offering on the climate crisis and other issues around equality, and vote for the future, not the past. I think the other thing people can be doing is looking at where they want to make their own kind of mark. So I get a lot of people saying, well, what should I be doing? What should I be eating? What should I be? I say, no. I mean, do your best on what you should be eating, best and less and better meat and dairy. Obviously, your own carbon footprint is important, but pick one thing that you're really passionate about and make that happen. So that could be, you live in a place where you really need to have much better ability to get to work by bike, and you work on your local level and engage with politicians there. It could be that you're tired of your kids not having proper textbooks around climate science, and you work there with the school board. It could be that you've decided that you need to get a national law passed that basically prohibits new fossil fuel from being explored. I think what we need now are more and more people, and there are so many millions of people who are out there taking action, but pick the thing that you're passionate about and work to make it happen while you're also doing things better for yourselves. I think yes, there's a role for consumers, but frankly, the power is in people making those changes to the policies, to the regulations, to the practices that we need, and connecting that in so that those things can happen quickly. As I said, we know what those policies and technologies are. It's really about a power shift in countries and globally that is needed and is underway in different places.
Justin, you said that the economy and economics are a powerful driver of change, and that there's been a growing acceptance of the need for the circular economy, and you've done a lot of focus on waste, given a lot of the environmental problems we face comes from a highly consumerist culture all across the globe. So what type of solutions or formulas do you think could solve the waste problem? This approach that it requires deep change to human behaviors.
Yeah, so I would actually combat that there needs to be a deep change to consumer behaviors. And in fact, let's take, for example, the platform that we're launching, Do Good Foods. And the focus there is on food waste. So 40% of all the food that we grow gets thrown away in the US, right? That's 2 out of every 5 grocery bags. That's a disgrace, right? And if food waste was a country, it'd be the 3rd largest greenhouse gas emitter. Coming out of COP, right, you saw all of these methane reduction pledges. Obviously, when food waste gets sent to landfill, it creates methane gas. So there's a tremendous inefficiency of not only the resources that went into creating that food, but then it's a huge economic burden for all of these retailers, the supermarkets, as they pay tens of millions of dollars per year just to get rid of their food waste. So what do? We go in there and we say, we'll pick up 100% of that food after any human donations can occur, and we'll pick it up for free. We'll save you tens of millions of dollars. And we'll pick up that food every couple of days and keep it in the cold chain so that we're actually preserving the nutrients of all of that food. And then based upon the EPA food hierarchy, after human consumption can occur, the next best usage of that food is to go into animals. So we've built major production facilities, as mentioned, $170–80 million behind the first one. We are now going to be duplicating that same production facility that's currently operational as we speak, converting 160 tons into an animal of food waste into an animal feed the very next day. We're going to be duplicating that nationwide across the United States to solve food waste from retailers over the next 5 or 7 years. But what's so exciting is that when we utilize that feed, we're simply then sending that to our farmers that grow a healthy, great tasting, delicious piece of chicken, and we can price it on the retail shelf that's affordable and accessible to everyone, well below organic. And so that's the way we're creating this economically viable, first and foremost, followed by this closed loop and sustainability initiative that I think can really drive every aspect of the equation, where we're not asking corporations from the retailers or the farmers or the consumers to do anything different. We're simply saying, put your food waste in these bins, farmer, grow with this feed. It goes right into your existing feed mill infrastructure, just like a corn and soy. And then consumer, here's a piece of chicken. And now this piece of chicken has a quantifiable equation that now helps fight food waste and combat climate change, and it's priced affordable and accessible to everyone. Why wouldn't you do good? And that's this whole notion that we're really driving towards, where we don't have time to hopefully convince policy, in my opinion, or hopefully convince corporations to really transition over. They all want to do it, but it has to be economically viable and scalable at the same time. And that's very difficult to do. It's taken us 5 years just for this own platform, and a lot of our own family capital and 20 of our own engineers to figure this out. But now that we're here, and now that there are a lot of other solutions across the board, whether it be cardboard or concrete or other waste streams, we now just need to have the actual financial capital behind us to just go off and just go do. And I think that's where we're getting to an exciting point where we can then showcase to the market and all the economic investors that this is actually the most profitable investment that you will ever make, not the long-term kind of focus on oil and gas and everything else.
So there's a lot of exciting startups out there. I think that technology is one of the areas, again, that can really help expedite the changes that need to happen. And this is something, David, that you touched on earlier. So among the many initiatives that the UN undertakes, are you guys exploring things around cloud, artificial intelligence, or remote sensing technologies or new startups that can help accelerate this path to sustainable development?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me touch on Justin's point. I mean, I completely agree about the need to influence consumer behaviors, but that has to happen on the basis of good quality data, right? So we need to monitor the environmental situation in real time, measure supply chains, and actually take that information so consumers can act on it. So one of the things that we're doing in the UN Environment Program is using a combination of data, AI, and cloud computing to monitor the planet on a real-time basis. So to monitor air quality, biodiversity quality, climate emissions, as real time as possible at a global scale, so we can begin to basically look at progress, bring transparency to progress, but really importantly, to feed that data into the digital economy so it can begin to influence those behaviors, begin to influence investment, and really begin to change the business models. That's really the key for us, is making sure that data now starts to flow in to the digital economy, to the algorithms that are optimizing different values, and really trying to use those algorithms to scale sustainable consumption, sustainable products and services.
Sharan, I want to ask you as well, what is something that every person can do to make a big difference? We've heard about the importance of voting, about the importance of relooking our own behaviors and investing in new technologies and examining the data. What would you recommend that people do to make a big difference to save the planet?
I think people have to actually use the political system, but they have to use their own voices. And you are seeing people, where they feel frustration with their policymakers, with corporate leaders, take to the streets. So people can choose their pathway, but we talk about taking action at your workplace. We call it CAPOW, climate and employment proofing our workplaces. And we train workers and to actually organise other workers to engage with their employer about what's the plan that is climate friendly, that protects and creates jobs, and make it available to people so that they have hope and can trust that they actually have a future. So getting engaged, whether it's through your political system, through your workplace, through a consumer choice, that's where it's really at, being conscious enough about getting engaged. And I would say for parents, support what Jennifer talked about, mandatory climate curriculum. Our teachers' unions around the world are fighting for this. We should be fighting alongside of them. If the leaders of tomorrow, but also the technicians, the architects, the mechanics, all of the people, the construction workers don't understand how we have to shift to the kind of production, the kind of waste management that Justin's talking about, then we will fail. So everybody can make a difference. There's no question about that. But in the end, we have to hold our policymakers to account, because if we don't, we won't rebuild the trust that people so badly want to depend on.
Okay, well, we're running out of time, so I want to go around the panel and ask you to provide your top 3 asks in terms of driving a green revolution as quickly as possible. So your top 3 asks that need to be executed immediately, or the top 3 trends to most look out for example, hydrogen-based energy. So Jennifer, let's start with you, your top 3, whatever you pick in terms of trends or your asks.
I guess I would, start with science and say no new fossil fuel installations around the world, but that has to be coupled with a growth of sustainable energy, accessible energy, affordable energy around the world at the same time. These need to be happening together. And I guess the third my top ask would just be to kick fossil fuel interests out of politics and decision making. We have seen what it has done in the United States around the bills that are out there for consideration now. And while I agree, and I think it's great to have companies out there that are looking, to do good, without the policy to move it, long, loud, legal, we won't get there. So long, loud, legal signals that put people and planet first.
David, I'm going to come to you next.
Sure, thanks. I would say 3 things. First, I would ask all digital platforms to adopt basically a set of standards or a pledge to really promote sustainability by default. So helping consumers find those sustainable products as the default recommendation or the default part of the algorithm. Number 2, adopting a digital product passport standards. And that's basically collecting kind of an information pod for all the products and services in the economy, where the environment and climate performance of that product or service can be stored, and where we can actually measure the supply chain and the life cycle of that product, again, so that consumers can compare and choose wisely. And the third thing I would say, which wasn't really talked about today, but it's really closing the digital divide in an equitable and sustainable way. I mean, half the planet is still disconnected. There's a lot of investment going in, but a lot of it is not yet green, and they're not really thinking about how to make that infrastructure sustainable. So that would be my third call to action. Thanks.
Sharan?
So I would say yes to everything Jennifer said, but actually also let's get the legislative provisions that say there are emissions caps. Nobody can deploy technology that actually emits more than X with a plan to end that as well. Let's end the craziness around offsets. The Indigenous people are right. This is often doing more harm to their communities than it is indeed doing good for the planet. And indeed, all investment must indeed be scrutinised to see that it's building genuine sustainability with a right space, or that social guarantee about jobs and rights and inclusion. So ESG lens on all investment. Unless we do those things, we're simply not going to win the race.
Justin, last but not least.
Sure. So I'll start off with 3 kind of different variations. First, I think that nuclear energy as actually a base load, very carbon friendly, and can actually hopefully replace obviously what coal and natural gas and oil obviously provide to the grid at this current moment, which is really the stability in the base load, enabling then renewables continue to scale with the battery solution. That's, I think, in my mind, key and critical to enact the transition at an actual feasible electricity kind of provider solution. The second is the utilization of upcycling materials and the adoption from the consumers of that terminology, while also simultaneously incentivizing farmers to actually implement regen practices and to eliminate kind of this BS subsidization of just kind of monoculture agriculture, but to actually truly incentivize and promote the whole utilization of a regen agriculture practice. And then finally, I keep going back to the consumers. If the consumers demand it and want it and desire it, corporations will change. It all goes back to what we're all talking about, which is money. Corporations have their earnings calls every month or every quarter. And if the consumers are going somewhere else and the consumers are not purchasing at that location because of that certain practice, they will start to change and they will start to shift in exponential time frame. And then that, if you can convince the top 20, 30 kind of companies, all of a sudden that trickle effect starts to hopefully really implement across the entire supply chains.
Jennifer, really quickly, Justin mentioned nuclear energy up top on his list. Greenpeace, what's the position on nuclear power?
Well, it's just so clearly not part of the future. It's expensive. It takes a long time. There's nuclear waste. It's dangerous. And there are way better ways of doing things. So for all of those reasons, we need to scale up the technologies that are much more beneficial for people and planet, and they're ready to go. It's really a matter, as Sharan also said, let's move the money where it needs to go, get rid of those fossil fuel subsidies, redeploy it. Those are the issues that we should be focusing on right now.
But if you were looking at renewables like solar power, wind, and so forth, I mean, will that be adequate to meet the energy consumption needs of both industry and such a large global population? If you look at the UK, they've already had to rely on going back to fossil fuel sources of energy if, let's say, the wind turbines in Scotland don't generate enough power.
So two parts. If the UK had actually invested in energy efficiency and insulated their homes, just imagine what it would be like. All of those promises. You need to do two sides of this coin. You need to both be doing the demand reductions and the energy efficiency parts of it, as well as looking at scaling up the renewable energy portions of it. And yeah, there needs to be further work done on storage, but right now in a number of countries, you can get to 100% renewables during the day, but it needs to be able to be sustained. And that's where the jobs are. That's where the multiple benefits are. And the just final thing, I just think, there's no negotiating with an atmosphere. We are in a climate emergency. We have to reduce emissions 7% a year in order to, every 10th of a degree matters. So, this cost benefit thing is, let's just get to work. It's so clear that we need to get moving.
Are you optimistic, Jennifer, that we will be able to achieve the deep systemic and behavioral changes needed to essentially save our planet?
I mean, I am optimistic insofar as because I see the people activity out there every day, and I see, as Sharan was saying, also the movements that are mobilizing. That's where I get my optimism from. But the response of leaders thus far has been abysmal. We need more people who are out there trying to make good things happen. But we need, without that, we are running truly. I know we've been saying this for a long time, but we are running out of time, and the price for our kids and for nature are extensive.
And David, at the UN, you have to build consensus globally. Do you feel optimistic that we will meet our targets?
I feel optimistic, again, provided we can start to harness some of these technologies and basically speed and scale and sustainability with them. Yeah, I'm very optimistic. I think if you look at some of the major platforms, we've got 3 billion people on social media. We've got 2.5 billion gamers. We got 2 people using e-commerce. Those are big numbers, right? And if we can influence them and help them make more sustainable choices, as we keep saying, yeah, we can scale action at an exponential rate. But it's really going to depend on the platform companies and the digital companies coming to the table and agreeing that they have a huge role to play. And then governments actually coming as well and enabling that kind of action through circular economy regulations, through ideas like this digital product passport. And as Justin said, consumers have to start signaling what they want in terms of how they spend. And I think the platform world is part of the future solution.
Sharan, do you really think that we can reach shared prosperity and our green growth targets without some kind of trade-offs?
If you're asking me, then we have to do everything possible to create an inclusive future. We think it's possible. Yes, there will be change, absolutely. But if you have a plan to actually create jobs, to engage workers in the skilling and the reskilling, to renew communities, and you've heard some of the ideas here today, then it can be done. There's just no doubt about that. But the political will, the company planning, where they actually talk to their workers and communities, this has to be at the forefront. That's why we talk about a just transition. No one's arguing. We have indeed, as Jennifer said, a climate emergency. We are in a race against time. We need to deploy all our resources. The world has the technology. Let's actually stop thinking about monopoly power making more and more money and start thinking about shared prosperity, and we can get the job done.
And last but not least, Justin, do you feel optimistic before we wrap? Can we get there?
I think we can, yes, but I'm going to stand by the notion and the focus that we're all screwed unless we do. And I think that rallying cry needs to be there, where we can't just say that we're optimistic. We just got to recognize that this has to happen and we need to enact this change.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up this session. A big thank you to Justin Kamine, co-founder and partner at KDC, Jennifer Morgan, Executive Director at Greenpeace International, Sharan Burrow, General Secretary at the International Trade Union Confederation, and David Jensen, Head of the Environmental Peacebuilding Program at UN Environment. Thanks very much for your time.